Please don't call my father. He doesn't know I got lost." The boy said it to nobody in particular, to the neon and the noise of grills hissing 3 floors below towering signs. 7 years old, a school blazer too clean for the hour, one fist closed around a wooden toy train car missing its wheels. Itaewon's Friday crowd rushed past him in a river of umbrellas and cigarette smoke. Nobody slowed, nobody looked twice. He pressed his back to a shuttered shopfront and made himself as small as he could, waiting for someone to notice he was disappearing. He had slipped out of his English academy an hour earlier, telling no one, chasing a memory instead of a route home. Somewhere on this street, before the accident, his mother used to buy him rice cakes from a cart with a red umbrella. He remembered her laugh more than her face now. He remembered the cart more than the words she used to say. But the cart was gone, or moved, or never real in the place he thought it was, and the rain had started, and his phone battery had died an hour ago inside his backpack. A shop owner waved him off from a doorway without breaking stride on his phone call. A group of office workers stepped around him like he was a puddle. He was learning, in real time, how easy it was to be a small, quiet, foreign-looking shape on a crowded street after dark. He did not cry. He had promised himself, somewhere between the academy and here, that he would not cry in public, because his grandmother said crying in public was a thing that made people stare instead of help, and he did not want to be stared at. He wanted to go home. That was when a woman in a black apron, still smelling of grilled pork belly and beer foam from her shift, slowed down without deciding to. She was thinking about her bus. She had exactly enough on her transit card to get home, and not 1 coin more. She almost kept walking, the way 12 other adults already had. Then the boy looked up at her with an expression she recognized instantly, because she had worn it herself once, in an airport, in a country that was not yet home, and nobody had stopped for her either. Chidman Wosu had learned in 3 years of double shifts across Seoul that the city was kindest to people who looked like they belonged and coldest to everyone else, and she had gotten very good at looking like she belonged, even when her feet ached and her apron reeked of grilled pork and cheap beer. She was 29 from Enugu, by way of a scholarship that fell through and a work visa that barely held, and she sent home more of her paycheck than she kept, because her younger sister Ngozi was 3 semesters from a nursing degree, and their late mother's hospital debt did not care whose turn it was to struggle. Tonight she had clocked out from Golden Hof 12 minutes late, which meant she would have to run for the last convenient bus and skip the earlier, cheaper one. And she had already done the math on her fare twice. The boy was still there when she reached the corner, smaller than she'd first thought, soaked at the shoulders, standing so still that half the street had probably mistaken him for a shop mannequin. She almost did too. It was the wooden toy train car in his fist that stopped her, the way he held it, not like a toy but like a compass, thumb-worn, smooth over one edge from being touched too many times. She had seen that grip before, on herself, on a photograph of her mother that she used to carry in a coat pocket until the coat wore through. Chidi crouched slightly, not too close, the way you approach something skittish and important. "Are you lost, small boy?" she asked in careful, unhurried Korean, the kind she had practiced for 2 years, specifically so strangers would stop flinching at her accent. He looked at her for a long moment, cataloging her, the way children do when they are deciding whether an adult is safe. Then he said, in English, quiet and precise, the kind of English private academies teach before they teach children how to ask for help. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." "Smart," she said, and did not move any closer. "I'm Chidi. Now I am not a stranger. I am Chidi who talks too much and has wet shoes. What's your name?" A beat, rain ticking off the awning above them. Somewhere behind her, a vendor shouted a closing time price at the last customers of the night. "Yoon Woo," he said finally, so softly she had to lean in to catch it, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the second syllable, the sound of a child who has been holding a single held breath for over an hour and has just, barely, let a little of it out. Yoon Woo would not say why he had run from his academy, not yet, and Chidi did not push. She had learned that children told the truth in layers, the outer one first, the real one only, after trust had been earned in small, boring, patient increments. "Okay, Yoon Woo," she said, straightening up and glancing at the darkening street. "Do you have a phone, a number, someone I can call?" He shook his head and held up the dead phone as evidence, screen black as the pavement. "My driver's number is written inside my bag, but I can't find the little paper anymore." She exhaled slowly through her nose, doing arithmetic she did not want to do. If she waited here to sort this out properly, she would miss her bus by a comfortable margin. And the next one did not come for 40 minutes. And by then, the fare would have changed to the surcharge rate she genuinely could not afford twice in 1 week. If she called the police, a foreign woman with an accent crouched over an unknown child. At 11 at night was not a story that reliably ended well for her, whatever the truth of it. If she simply walked away, told herself someone else would help, the way she had told herself 100 small things in 3 years to survive this city, she would have to live with the particular shape of that decision for a long time. She thought of her mother, who used to say that Enugu women did not walk past a hungry child, no matter whose child it was, that hunger did not carry a family name. She thought of Ngozi's tuition, of the fare in her pocket, of Mrs. Choi's warning about being late twice more this month. Then she looked down at Yunwoo, who had gone quiet again, watching her weigh him the way children always know, somehow, when they are being weighed. "Have you eaten?" she asked instead of any of the questions in her head. He blinked, surprised by the question's simplicity. "No," he admitted. "I was looking for a food cart. My mother used to buy teokbokki from one, near here, but I can't find it anymore." There it was, the first real layer, delivered sideways the way children deliver the truths that hurt most. Chidi felt the sentence land somewhere under her ribs. "Then we find you food first," she said, already turning toward the cart 2 doors down, already spending money she had not planned to spend, on a decision she had not fully made yet, but somehow already had. "Everything else comes after dinner. That is the rule tonight." The cart owner, an older woman with flour dust permanently ground into the creases of her hands, served them 2 portions of teokbokki and a paper cup of fish cake broth, without asking a single question, which Chidi had come to recognize as its own quiet form of kindness in this city, the kind that did not require explanation to be given. Yunwoo ate like someone who had forgotten he was hungry until the food arrived, small, careful bites at first, then faster, steam fogging faintly against the cold air. Chidi tore a paper napkin from the dispenser and, out of habit more than plan, began folding it, corner to corner, the way her mother had taught her on long train platforms when she was small and restless, and needed her hands occupied more than her mouth needed to complain. "What is that?" Yunwoo asked, around a mouthful of rice cake, watching her fingers work. "A crane," she said, tucking the last fold into place and setting the small white shape upright on the counter between them. "In Igbo, my mother used to say, 'Enduna agaji efu,' life is never wasted. And she said cranes carry wishes home because they always know which way is north even in the dark. So, cranes carry wishes home. That's the whole saying." Yunwoo studied the paper bird for a long moment, then picked it up carefully, the way he'd been holding the wheelless train car all evening, and set it beside his empty rice cake skewer like it belonged there. He did not smile, not quite, but something in his shoulders came down half an inch, the particular unclenching of a child who has decided, provisionally, that the adult in front of him is not going to disappear in the next 5 minutes. Around them, the street had begun to thin. A drunk man in a rumpled suit stumbled past their table, glanced at Yunwoo, muttered something about parents who couldn't keep track of their own children, and kept walking without breaking stride, without offering a phone, without asking a single useful question. Chidi watched him go and said nothing, because she had learned there was no arguing with people who had already decided a problem was not theirs. She had learned it the hard way, more than once in 3 years of being the only person in a room who looked like her. When the bill came, small as it was, Chidi paid it with the exact bills she had set aside for her bus fare, counting them out with the specific care of someone who knows precisely what she is giving up and has decided anyway. The cart owner, watching this arithmetic without commenting on it, quietly added an extra fish cake to Yunwoo's cup and refused to take money for it, sliding it across with a small nod that Chidi understood as its own language. Outside, the rain had thickened into something steadier, and the last bus of the cheaper line pulled away from the stop 2 blocks down while she was still helping Yunwoo zip his blazer against the cold, a detail she noticed and did not mention. 40 minutes now, or a walk home through wet streets and shoes that were not built for it. She chose not to think about it directly, and instead crouched in front of him again. "Okay, detective, tell me your school's name, and the name on your driver's badge if you remember it, and we will figure this out together, yes?" Yunwoo recited both with the crisp accuracy of a child who has been drilled in emergency information since infancy, a detail that told Chidi something about the kind of household he came from before she had any other evidence at all. She borrowed the card owner's battered flip phone and called the academy's after-hours line, then the school's general office, working the short chain of contacts a 7-year-old could reasonably supply, feeling the cold settle into her damp shoulders while she waited on hold. Yunwoo stood close beside her now, not touching her sleeve, but near enough that his shoulder occasionally grazed her arm, an orbit he seemed to have decided on without announcing it. Somewhere in the third call, a man's clipped, controlled voice on the other end of the academy's line went suddenly very still when she gave Yunwoo's name, and asked her twice to confirm exactly where they were standing, and told her, in a tone that expected to be obeyed without question, not to move. She did not know yet whose voice that was. She only knew that something in it had gone taut like a wire pulled to its limit, the sound of someone who had been afraid of exactly this call for longer than tonight. The black sedan arrived 19 minutes later, sleek and silent in a way that looked deliberately out of place on the wet, ordinary street, and out of it came a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, who introduced himself simply as Mr. Bay before crouching immediately in front of Yunwoo to check him over with the practiced, wordless efficiency of someone who had done this exact motion in his sleep, checking for injury before checking for anything else. "You are not hurt," he said, not quite a question, running a hand briefly over Yunwoo's shoulders. "No," Yunwoo said, and then, unprompted, in the small, clear voice of a child reporting facts he considers important, "Chidi bought me tteokbokki. She used her bus money. She said cranes carry wishes home." Mr. Bay looked up at Chidi properly for the first time then, taking in the damp apron, the exact posture of someone who had given up something specific and did not plan to mention it. "You missed your bus for him," he said, and it was not a question either. Chidi shrugged, suddenly self-conscious under the attention, aware of how it must look from the outside. A stranger who had spent money, she visibly did not have to spare on a child she had known for less than an hour. He was hungry and cold, and it was the fastest way to make him not those things, she said simply. "I would do it for anyone's child." Mr. Bay studied her for a beat longer than the moment required, then reached into his coat for a folded envelope of cash, extending it toward her with the automatic confidence of a man used to problems that dissolved when money was applied to them. Chidi looked at the envelope, then at him, and stepped back half a pace, hands staying at her sides. "I don't want that," she said, and something in her voice went firm in a way it had not been all evening. "I'm not asking for anything. Please just get him home and dry." Bay's expression shifted, surprise flickering somewhere under decades of professional composure, and he did not push the envelope again. Above them, mounted discreetly under the cart's own security camera, and, unknown to Chidi, on the dash cam of the sedan idling at the curb, the entire exchange had been quietly recording itself the whole time, time-stamped and complete, waiting for someone 40 minutes away in a glass office tower to watch it in full silence 3 separate times before he said a single word to anyone. She walked the 40 minutes home in the rain because the later bus would still have cost more than she had left. And she told herself the whole way that it did not matter, that this was simply what the night had cost, and she had paid it willingly and would do it again tomorrow if the same small boy needed the same small kindness. Her shoes were ruined by the time she reached her one-room apartment above a shuttered dry cleaners, and she hung her wet apron over the radiator and ate cold rice standing at the counter because she was too tired to cook. And she thought briefly about the paper crane still sitting on the food cart counter, forgotten in the rush of the sedan's arrival, and hoped Yunwoo had remembered to take his home instead. Across the city, in a glass tower on Teheran-ro that stayed lit long after its neighbors went dark, Han Jae-won watched the dash cam footage for the 3rd time in a conference room built for negotiations far larger than this one, his tie loosened, his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man working very hard not to feel something in front of his staff. He watched the woman crouch to his son's eye level without hesitation. He watched her count out bills she clearly could not spare. He watched her decline the envelope Bay offered twice, without a flicker of performance in her face. The kind of performance he had grown expert at detecting after 14 months of condolence calls and quietly calculating relatives. He watched his son, who had not strung together more than 6 consecutive words to another adult since the funeral, describe a paper crane and a saying about wishes with the animated, unguarded voice of a child who had, for 1 hour, forgotten to be careful. Jaewon paused the footage on a single frame of Chidi's face, mid-sentence, mid-refusal, and sat with it in silence long enough that his chief of staff eventually knocked and let herself in, asking if he needed anything before she left for the night. "Find her," he said, not looking away from the screen. "Quietly. I want to know who she is before I decide what to do about it." "No." It took Bae 4 days to find her, not because it was difficult, but because Jaewon had insisted on discretion over speed. And when Chidi looked up from wiping down a table at Golden Hof to find a tall man in an expensive coat standing just inside the doorway, out of place among the pork belly smoke and karaoke noise, she assumed at first that he was lost. He was not lost. He introduced himself with a slight, formal bow that felt oddly old-fashioned in a Hof full of drunk salarymen, and said his name was Han Jae-won, and watched her face for the flicker of recognition that never came, because she did not read business news and had never once connected the boy with the toy train to the name printed on half the construction cranes reshaping the skyline she walked under every day. "You're Yoonwoo's father," she said instead, understanding arriving through the more relevant door. "Is he all right?" The question, asked first and without hesitation, before any question about herself, seemed to land on him the way it had landed on Bae 4 nights earlier, an answer he had not expected and did not quite know how to receive gracefully. "He's all right," Jaewon said. "Better than all right. He hasn't stopped talking about you." Mrs. Choi, watching this exchange from behind the counter with the sharp instincts of a woman who had survived 30 years of Itaewon's shifting fortunes, materialized at Chidi's elbow with an offer of tea that Jaewon accepted more out of manners than thirst. He sat stiffly in a booth, clearly not designed for men who wore suits like his, and after a silence that stretched longer than either of them meant it to, he reached into his coat and produced not an envelope this time, but a business card, sliding it across the table with 2 fingers. "I want to properly thank you," he said. "Whatever amount makes sense to you. Please don't refuse this one out of pride. I understand pride. I also understand what you gave up that night, and I would like to make it right." Chidi looked at the card without picking it up, feeling something familiar and tired rise in her, the particular fatigue of being offered money in place of being seen. "I don't need it made right," she said. "It already was right the moment he ate and got home safe. If you want to thank me, ask me how I'm doing sometime. That's usually enough." Jaewon left the card on the table anyway, and Chidi let it sit there, and for a moment neither of them moved to resolve the small standoff until he cleared his throat and tried a different approach entirely, one that surprised her with how much less rehearsed it sounded. "He asks about you every day," he said. "He's drawn 6 pictures of a paper crane. My housekeeper doesn't know what to do with that information, and neither do I, honestly. He hasn't been this specific about wanting anything since his mother died." The sentence arrived plainly, without performance, and Chidi understood immediately that this was the real reason he had come. Not gratitude exactly, but a father out of his depth, trying to translate his son's grief into a request he could actually act on. "I'm not a nanny," she said carefully, because she needed to say the boundary out loud before she could consider what came next. "I have 2 jobs already. I can't just show up because a rich man asked me to." "I'm asking you to consider it as a job," Jaewon said. "A real one, with a real contract, afternoons only, picking him up from school and staying until I get home. Not charity, not a favor. Work, the kind you do for anyone, except it happens to be for him." Chidi turned the offer over in her mind, the way she turned over every decision that touched her finances, weighing the extra income against her exhaustion, weighing her fondness for a boy she'd known for 1 rainy hour against the discomfort of stepping into a household this large and this guarded. She thought of Ngozi's next tuition installment, due in 6 weeks. She thought of Yoonwoo's small, unclenched shoulders over a bowl of rice cakes. "Afternoons only," she said finally. "I keep my other work, and if it stops being good for him, I walk away. No questions, no explanations owed." Jaewon nodded once, the closest thing to relief she had seen cross his face since he'd walked in. "Afternoons only," he agreed, and something in the set of his shoulders loosened by exactly the same half-inch she had watched loosen in his son 4 nights earlier, a family resemblance neither of them noticed yet, but which was, in fact, the very first thing they truly had in common. Or the penthouse elevator required its own keycard, which Chidi found faintly absurd the first afternoon and simply practical by the second week. One small detail among many, in a home so large it had its own weather, cool and climate-controlled and quiet in a way her one-room apartment never was. Yoon-woo met her at the door each afternoon with the same barely suppressed excitement, a child rationing his own enthusiasm because he had not yet fully believed she would keep showing up. They fell into a rhythm neither of them had planned. Homework at the kitchen island, her rough attempts at Korean vocabulary, corrected patiently by a 7-year-old who found her mistakes hilarious in a way that made her repeat them on purpose just to hear him laugh. His slow, careful attempts at the Igbo words she taught him back, Ndu and Odanihu, and the phrase about cranes that he now knew by heart and said unprompted at strange, unrelated moments, the way children adopt phrases that feel true to them. She taught him to make jollof rice one Tuesday, standing him on a step stool at a safe distance from the stove, and he taught her, with visible pride, the correct way to fold dumplings the way his grandmother had shown him once, years ago, a memory he offered without being asked, which Chidi understood was its own kind of gift. The housekeeper, Mrs. Yang, watched all of this from the doorway some afternoons, with an expression Chidi couldn't quite read until the day Mrs. Yang finally said it out loud, quietly, while Yoon-woo was occupied with his workbook. "He hasn't eaten a full dinner without being coaxed in over a year. Look at him." Chidi looked. Yoon-woo was 3 bites into a bowl of rice and stew, talking with his mouth slightly too full about a paper crane he wanted to fold with gold foil instead of plain paper, narrating his own plan to no one in particular, the way children do, when they have finally stopped monitoring themselves for an audience. It was such a small thing, a boy eating dinner and talking too much while he did it, and Chidi felt it anyway, low and warm in her chest. The specific ache of watching something broken quietly start repairing itself in front of you, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Weeks folded into each other, the way ordinary things do when they are working, unremarkably, without ceremony. Chidi learned the penthouse's small rituals, which cabinet held the good chopsticks Yoon-woo preferred, which corner of the living room got the best afternoon light for reading, the exact volume at which the television could play his favorite show without triggering a headache in Mrs. Yang. She started leaving a small container of leftover jollof rice in the refrigerator's second shelf out of habit, half for Yoon-woo's lunch the next day, and half, if she was honest with herself, in case anyone else in the household ever got curious enough to try it. Jaewon's schedule remained a mystery to her, most days, a man who existed mainly as a name Yoon-woo mentioned, and a set of headlights she sometimes glimpsed through the window, arriving well after she had gone home. But the reports must have reached him regardless, because one Thursday, without any announcement, he came home at 6 instead of 9. He stood in the hallway for a long moment before either of them noticed him, watching through the kitchen doorway, as Chidi laughed at something Yoon-woo said, her whole face open in a way he had not seen a stranger's face be, inside these walls in over a year, watching his son gesture with a wooden spoon like he owned the room. A version of Yoon-woo he had almost forgotten existed underneath the careful, quiet child who had learned to take up as little space as possible after the accident. He did not announce himself immediately. He stood there instead, unnoticed, coat still on, watching the two of them exist so easily together in his kitchen, and felt something complicated move through him that he did not yet have a word for, something adjacent to gratitude and something else entirely separate from it, something that made him loosen his tie before he had even decided to step into the room. He stepped into the kitchen doorway eventually, and Yoon-woo lit up immediately, mid-sentence, abandoning his wooden spoon to launch into an update about his day that assumed his father had been present for all the parts he'd missed. Chidi straightened at the counter, suddenly self-conscious in a kitchen that was not hers, though Jaewon waved off her half-formed apology before she could finish it. "Stay," he said. "Please, there's more than enough." It became, without either of them quite naming it as a new arrangement, a semi-regular thing over the following weeks. Jaewon coming home earlier than his schedule technically allowed, eating at the kitchen island instead of alone in his study, tasting Chidi's cooking with the wary caution of a man who had eaten mostly the same 6 meals for over a year, and found himself unexpectedly ambushed by flavor. "This is very spicy," he said the first time, with the strained dignity of someone determined not to show weakness in front of a 7-year-old. "It's medium," Chidi said. "I made it mild on purpose." "I don't believe you. You're very sensitive for a man who runs a company." Yunwoo laughed so hard at that he nearly choked on his water. And something crossed Jaewon's face that Chidi had not seen there before, an actual unguarded smile, brief and slightly startled, like a muscle he hadn't used in some time. Later, after Yunwoo had been put to bed and Mrs. Yang had gone home for the night, Chidi lingered longer than her job technically required, wiping down a counter that did not need wiping, and Jaewon lingered too, leaning against the opposite side of the island with a glass of water he wasn't drinking. "Thank you," he said, quieter than before. "For whatever you're doing, I don't fully understand it, but I can see it." Chidi kept her eyes on the counter. "He's easy to love," she said. "That's all it is." "It's not all it is," Jaewon said, and the sentence sat in the room a beat too long, honest in a way neither of them had planned for, before Mrs. Yang's key turned unexpectedly in the front door, and the moment folded itself neatly away, unfinished, into the growing collection of things between them that had not yet been said out loud. The near touches accumulated the way small things do when neither person is willing to name them. A hand that lingered half a second too long, passing a dish, a glance held across the kitchen island that neither looked away from first, a Tuesday when Jaewon asked, almost shyly, whether she'd teach him one of the Igbo words Yunwoo kept using, and she did, and he mangled the pronunciation so badly that Yunwoo laughed until he had to sit down, and Chidi laughed too, harder than she'd laughed in Seoul in 3 years. She began noticing things about him she hadn't expected to notice, the exact way his composure cracked slightly around his son and nowhere else. The fact that he still wore his late wife's favorite mug for his morning coffee, though he never once mentioned her by name in front of Chidi. A private grief he carried the way Chidi carried her mother's, quietly in the objects rather than the words. One evening, drying dishes together, while Yunwoo showed Mrs. Yang his latest gold foil crane in the next room, Jaewon told her, without being asked, about the accident. A storm, a highway, a phone call. He still replayed at 3 a.m, more than a year later. The particular guilt of a man who had been in a meeting instead of in the car, who kept a mug because it was easier than admitting the rest of the house had already moved on without him giving it permission. Chidi did not offer comfort in the form of words because she understood instinctively that this was not what he wanted. She simply kept drying the dish in her hands and let the silence hold what it needed to hold. In return, unprompted, she told him about Lagos, about a mother who worked 3 jobs and still found time to fold paper cranes with her daughters on the nights money ran short, about the specific shame of watching a scholarship dissolve and choosing Seoul anyway because there was nothing left to lose by trying. Neither of them reached for the other's hand that night, though both, later, separately, in the privacy of their own rooms, would admit to themselves that they had wanted to, and had stopped only because it felt too large a thing to begin by accident in a kitchen, with dish towels still damp between their fingers. The summons came on stiff cream paper, delivered by Bae with an apologetic look that told Chidi more than the words on the card did. Han Soon-ja, chairwoman emeritus of the Hanul Group and Jaewon's grandmother, requested her presence for tea, alone at 4 o'clock. No children, no exceptions. The tea room was traditional in a way the rest of the penthouse tower was not. Low tables and paper screens, and a silence so complete it seemed to have its own weight. Sunja poured the tea herself, a courtesy Chidi understood immediately was not really a courtesy, but the opening move of an interrogation conducted with exquisite manners. "You've been in my great-grandson's life for 2 months, Sunja said, without preamble, her eyes assessing Chidi over the rim of her cup, with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had spent 60 years learning to read people before they finished a sentence. "Tell me honestly, what is it you want from this family?" Chidi set her own cup down carefully. "Nothing, ma'am. I was hired to help a boy who needed help. I've done that. If you're asking whether I want something more, I understand why you'd ask. But the honest answer is, I haven't been thinking that far ahead." "Everyone thinks that far ahead," Sunja said, not unkindly, simply as fact. "A visa, a green card equivalent, a payout to disappear quietly when it suits you. I have seen every version of this story, Miss Nwosu, and they all end the same expensive way." "I'm not everyone," Chidi said, and kept her voice level, though her pulse was not. "I can't prove that to you in 1 cup of tea. I can only keep showing up and let you watch what actually happens instead of what you're afraid will happen. Sunja studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her composed expression, and refilled Chidi's cup without being asked, a gesture Chidi could not yet tell whether to read as approval or simply habit. My grandson has not eaten a full dinner at that table since my great-granddaughter-in-law died, Sunja said finally, quieter. Bae tells me this changed 2 months ago. I am old enough to know that gratitude and love are not the same feeling, and young enough still to worry which one is happening in my own home. Sunja set down the teapot and with the same unhurried composure, produced a sealed envelope from within her sleeve, sliding it across the low table with 2 fingers in a gesture Chidi recognized instantly, having seen its twin once already from Bae on a rainy street 4 months earlier. This is a considerable amount, Sunja said. Enough to finish your sister's degree, I understand, and pay off whatever remains of your mother's debt, with a comfortable margin besides. In exchange, you resign your position quietly. Tell my great-grandson you found better work in another city, and do not contact this family again. Chidi looked at the envelope for a long moment, feeling the specific vertigo of watching an amount of money that could solve nearly every practical problem in her life, sitting 3 feet away from her hand. She thought of Ngozi's tuition notice, still unpaid on her kitchen table. She thought of 3 years of double shifts and worn shoes and careful, exhausting Korean. Then she thought of Yoonwoo's small, unclenched shoulders over a bowl of rice cakes, of a boy who had finally, slowly, learned to talk with his mouth full again, and she pushed the envelope back across the table, further than it needed to go. I taught him that cranes carry wishes home, Chidi said, and her voice did not shake, though she felt it wanting to. If I take this and disappear, I've taught him the opposite lesson instead, that people who love you can be paid to leave. I won't do that to him to make my own life easier, no matter how much easier it would make it. The silence that followed was long enough that Chidi wondered if she had just ended everything, the job, the friendship, whatever the unfinished thing with Jae-won had been becoming. Sunja finally withdrew her hand from the envelope, leaving it untouched on the table between them, her expression giving away nothing definitive, and stood, smoothing her skirt with brisk finality. We are not finished having this conversation, the old woman said, which was not agreement and was not refusal either, only an unresolved verdict hanging in the tea room's still air, as she left Chidi alone with an envelope neither of them had claimed. Iho. The photograph ran 3 days later on a gossip site that specialized in exactly this kind of story. Chidi, grainy and grocery-laden, caught mid-stride entering the tower's residential entrance at 9 at night. The headline built around words like mystery woman and quietly moved in, and questions about the Hanul heir's new domestic arrangement, none of it accurate, all of it damaging in the specific efficient way half-truths always are. By morning, the story had multiplied across 3 more outlets, each one adding speculation. The last one hadn't quite dared, one openly floating the word gold digger beside a cropped photo of her apron from Golden Hof. Another running an unflattering comparison to Soo-min Kong, the board vice chair's daughter long assumed, in circles Chidi had never been part of, to be Jae-won's eventual match. Mrs. Choi called Chidi into the back office before her shift even started. Apologetic and visibly frightened, 2 photographers already camped outside the restaurant's front window. I can't have this outside my door every night, Mrs. Choi said, not unkindly but firmly, wringing a dish towel between her hands. I have to let you go from the evening shifts just until this settles. I'm sorry. I have a business to think of. Chidi nodded, absorbing one more cost of the last 4 months without argument, because arguing with fear rarely worked, and she was too tired to try. At the Hanul boardroom across the city, a different version of the same story was being weaponized with considerably more polish. A board member, Soo-min's father among them, raised the optics of a family stability narrative destabilized by tabloid speculation right before a critical merger vote, suggesting, in the careful language executives use for threats, that Jae-won's personal choices were becoming a liability the shareholders had not signed up for. And at school, in the small, brutal economy of 7-year-olds repeating things they had overheard at home, another child told Yoonwoo his father's girlfriend was only after the money, using a word for her that Yoonwoo did not fully understand but recognized from the tone alone as an insult aimed at someone he loved, and he came home that afternoon, quieter than Chidi had seen him in months, refusing to explain why. Chidi found Yoon-woo that evening sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, methodically tearing a half-folded paper crane into small, deliberate pieces, and when she asked what was wrong, he wouldn't look up from the paper scraps scattered around his knees. "A boy said you only like me because of my dad's money," he said finally, flat and young and furious in the particular way children are furious when they don't yet have words sized correctly for the feeling. Is that true? The question landed like a physical blow, worse somehow than anything the tabloids had printed, because it came from the one person in this whole complicated arrangement whose good opinion she had never once calculated the cost of earning. She sat down on the floor across from him, matching his height, matching the wreckage of paper between them. "No," she said, simple and unflinching. "I liked you before I knew your father had any money at all. I liked you when you were a boy alone on a street corner with a wheelless toy train, and that is still the boy I like now, underneath all of this." He studied her face for a long moment with the same cataloging look he'd given her that first rainy night, deciding whether to believe her, and something in him seemed to settle, if not entirely, then enough for now. That night, after he was finally asleep, Chidi sat alone in her own small apartment and looked, for a long time, at the stack of unpaid bills on her table, and the articles still trending on her phone screen, and the accumulating weight of a situation she had never asked to be the center of. She thought about Mrs. Choi's frightened face, about the board members' leaked comments, about Sunja's untouched envelope still sitting somewhere in that tea room, about whether the kindest thing she could do for a family already under this much pressure was simply to remove herself from the equation before the pressure broke something permanently. She packed a single bag before she let herself think too hard about it, set it by her door, and stood there a long moment with her hand resting on the handle, not yet turning it, the whole decision balanced on a hinge she had not fully closed. It was Yoon-woo who told his father, in the end, sitting rigid at the breakfast table the next morning and refusing his food entirely, that Chidi's bag was packed, that she had said goodbye to him the night before, in a voice that sounded like the goodbyes in movies right before someone doesn't come back. Jae-won left the boardroom mid-briefing without explanation, a thing he had never once done in 11 years running the company, and arrived at Chidi's building 40 minutes later, still in his suit, Bae idling the car at the curb behind him. He found her on the front step, bag in hand, exactly one motion away from leaving for a bus she hadn't fully decided the destination of yet. "Don't," he said, breathless in a way that had nothing to do with the stairs. "Whatever you've decided tonight, please don't decide it because of a headline that isn't true." "It's not about the headline," Chidi said, though they both understood it was, at least partly. "It's about what it's costing everyone around me to have me in this picture. Mrs. Choi lost customers. Your board is using me as leverage against you. Yoon-woo got called names by a classmate because of something I can't control. I don't want to be the reason your family keeps bleeding." Jae-won stepped closer, close enough that Chidi had to look up to hold his eyes. "Then let me fix the reason," he said. "Not by paying you to disappear, by telling the truth loudly enough that there's nothing left to speculate about." That afternoon, in a hastily called statement that stunned his own communications team, Jae-won stood in front of cameras he normally avoided and said, plainly, without a single hedge his lawyers would have preferred, that Shidman Wo-soo had saved his son on a rainy night, for no reason except that it was the right thing to do, that she worked for his family because his son loved her, and because he had come, slowly and without meaning to love her too, and that any board member who considered his son's well-being a liability was welcome to say so to his face instead of to the press. The room went very quiet. Somewhere in the back, Sumin's father closed his notebook without writing anything further down. Chidi watched the statement later that evening on a phone screen propped against a mug in her small kitchen, hearing her own name said out loud by a man on national business news in a sentence that also, unmistakably contained the word love, and she had to sit down on the edge of her bed for a full minute before she trusted herself to move again. It was one thing to feel something building quietly between two people over months of dish towels and near-touched hands. It was another thing entirely to hear it declared publicly on the record, at obvious professional cost to the person declaring it. She thought about what she owed herself in this moment, not what she owed Yoon-woo or Jae-won or even Sunja, but what she owed the version of herself that had walked off a plane 3 years ago with one suitcase and a promise not to disappear into anyone else's story. When Jae-won arrived at her door an hour later, still faintly wired from the press room, she met him with the bag still visible behind her in the hallway, unresolved, and told him plainly what she needed if this was going to become something real. No more envelopes, no more being handled or decided about behind closed doors. No PR narrative built around her without her consent. A say in her own story from now on, always. "I'm not something your family manages," she said. "If this is real, I need to be asked every time, not informed after the decision's already made." Jae-won nodded, slowly, absorbing the weight of what she was actually asking for, which was not romance exactly, not yet, but the basic dignity of being treated as a full person inside a family, used to treating people as problems to be solved. "Asked," he repeated, like he was committing the word to memory. "Every time, I can do that." He did not reach for her hand that night, respecting the space she still visibly needed, but he stayed on her doorstep long after he should have left, neither of them quite ready to close the door on the conversation, both of them aware that something had shifted permanently in the last 24 hours, even if neither could yet say exactly into what. Chidi did not leave the following morning, but she nearly did the morning after that, when a formal immigration letter arrived flagging her visa sponsorship for review following the media attention. A bureaucratic complication with no villain attached to it, just paperwork moving at its own indifferent speed. And she found herself at the immigration office 3 days later, filling out forms for a possible return flight. Telling herself it was only prudent to have options. She was still in the waiting room, form half completed on her lap, when Jae-won found her, having tracked her there through Bae after Yoon-woo mentioned, worried that she'd left that morning in her good coat instead of her work clothes. He sat down beside her without asking permission this time, out of breath again, and set 2 things on the plastic chair between them. The wooden toy train car, no longer wheelless, fully restored with new wheels, Yoon-woo had picked out himself at a hobby shop the previous weekend, and a small paper crane folded not from a napkin this time, but from a single square of gold foil, its edges precise in a way that suggested he'd practiced the fold more than once before getting it right. "Sunja finished the conversation," he said before Chidi could ask. "She wants you at dinner Sunday. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, that a woman who refuses money twice has earned the right to refuse it a 3rd time in person, over a proper meal." Chidi laughed despite herself, something in her chest loosening for the first time in days. "And this?" she asked, nodding at the gold crane in his palm. Jae-won held it out to her, his composure slipping into something rawer and less rehearsed than the press conference had been. "Cranes carry wishes home," he said, echoing the words he'd heard his son repeat 100 times over the past months, the words that had somehow become the private language of this entire strange, improbable family. "I want this one to stay home, with us, if you'll let it." Chidi looked at the small gold shape in his open hand for a long moment, then reached out and closed her fingers gently around both the crane and his hand at once, an answer that needed no further words attached to it. Weeks later, on an ordinary Sunday morning that no tabloid would ever bother photographing, Chidi stood at the same marble kitchen island, folding paper cranes with Yoon-woo while a pot of jollof rice simmered beside a pot of soup. Mrs. Yang had taught her to season properly, and Jae-won leaned in the doorway in bare feet and no tie, watching the two of them the way he had that the first Thursday months ago, except this time he crossed the room and joined them instead of standing at the edge of it. The gold crane from the immigration office sat on the windowsill now, permanently, alongside a small growing flock of ordinary paper ones. Yoon-woo insisted on folding every week regardless of occasion, and beside them, in a place of unlikely honor, sat the fully wheeled wooden train car, no longer a talisman of a lonely night, but simply a toy again, allowed at last to be nothing more than what it looked like. Sunja had come to dinner twice since that first invitation, softening by careful, unhurried degrees, the way people do when they are given evidence instead of promises. And Chidi's visa paperwork had resolved itself quietly, unremarkably, the way most things eventually do once the noise around them dies down. Ngozi's tuition was paid in full, and Chidi had told her the whole improbable story over a video call, both of them laughing until they cried at how it sounded out loud. a Nigerian woman, and a Korean boy's wheelless toy train, and a paper crane that ended up meaning more than anyone intended it to. Yunwoo held up his latest fold for inspection, slightly lopsided, deeply proud. "This one's for you," he told Chidi, setting it carefully in her palm the way she had once set the very first one in his. "Cranes carry wishes home," she said back to him, smiling, closing her fingers around the small paper shape exactly the way she had learned months ago that home sometimes finds you on a rainy street corner when you least expect it, and stays if you let it. If a story like theirs moved you, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe to Melanin and Soul so you never miss the next one we tell.